Yeah.
Do you want me to pull the questions up, or you?
Well, I need to have. You just have any questions, Andy?
Yeah. Bad idea. And is it you guessed you're doing? Or is there a different way?
Okay, welcome back, everyone. I think folks will be trickling in, but I wanted to get started on the introduction of this panel so that we can have as much time as possible on the substantive content of it. This is our panel designed to think about news and the spread of information on matters of public concern and the use of social media to do those things. Part of what we're really interested in exploring at this symposium are the sort of two sides of the same coin, that these tools that create at least some potential risks for viral spread of things that are not true are also tools that are really valuable for spread of really important things that are true. They are mechanisms by which many, many people receive local and national news and conduct conversations about our most important topics of public concern. And we've compiled here a remarkable group of national experts on news, information, and discussion of matters of public concern in a social media age. And I just want to introduce them to you right now. Moving this direction, we have Dahlia Lithwick, who is senior editor and legal correspondent for Slate. Along with her role as senior editor, Dahlia writes the Supreme Court dispatches and jurisprudence columns for Slate. Her work has also appeared in the New York Times, Harper's, the Washington Post, and Commentary. She received the Online News Association's Award for Online Commentary multiple times, and she was the first online journalist invited to serve on the steering committee for the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. Dahlia is a national political reporter who has a real presence on social media and a following both as a writer and as a curator of news on other matters, and so she'll be a really important boots-on-the-ground journalistic voice on this panel. Next to her is Sonja R. West, who is the Otis Brumby Distinguished Professor in First Amendment Law at the University of Georgia. Sonja specializes in constitutional law, media law, and the United States Supreme Court. She's authored articles about legal issues for multiple publications, including Slate and the Huffington Post, and is a frequent commentator for various media outlets, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, The Economist, the Boston Globe, and the Guardian. She served as a judicial clerk for U.S. Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens and Judge Dorothy W. Nelson of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. Next to her is David Greene, who is the senior staff, sorry, is that right? I can't actually see who's down there. Yes, good. Is the senior staff attorney and civil liberties director for the Electronic Frontier Foundation. He oversees the EFF's free speech and privacy litigation and is a leading expert on and advocate for freedom of expression. He was a founding member of the Internet Free Expression Alliance, and he currently serves on the governing committee of the ABA Forum on Communications Law. David is also an adjunct professor at the University of San Francisco School of Law, where he teaches classes in First Amendment and media law, and he's an instructor in journalism at San Francisco State University as well. Finally, we have Lili Levi, who's a professor of law and the Dean's Distinguished Scholar and Vice Dean for Intellectual Life at the University of Miami School of Law. Her current scholarship focuses primarily on media law and policy and has appeared in a variety of law reviews, with her most recent contribution, the title of which is my favorite law review title, perhaps of all time. Real Fake News and Fake News is the title of this piece, and appears in the First Amendment Law Review. She's a member of the ALI and is the current chair of the Association of American Law Schools section on communication, media, and information law. Before becoming a law professor, she worked as broadcast counsel for CBS, and she now teaches media law, copyright law, and business associations. Please join me in welcoming our panelists. All right, so I want to dive right in and start with our journalist, Dahlia, and give her the chance to sort of speak to some trends that we have seen discussed in the journalism community sort of writ large and amongst social media commentators in particular about the impact that social media and social media companies might be having or have already had on news and the news gathering culture. And I'm wondering if you can speak particularly to things that we hear journalists saying about sort of the increased importance of clicks, right? The sort of shift in individual branding of yourself on social media over a sort of institutional legacy media model, and questions about in the sort of larger sense of how this changing media landscape has changed what's happening in terms of real news gathering and truth-telling. What are your observations in terms of those major trends?
So first of all, thank you. It's an honor and pleasure to be here. I feel like my job on this panel is to be like grumpy old man shakes fist at cloud, and to just be like, oh, in the good old days. So I will try to do that to the best of my ability. I've been covering chiefly the U.S. Supreme Court, but also other legal matters for 2 decades, and without a doubt, the change has been seismic. I think it is probably fair to say that U.S. Supreme Court press coverage changed almost not at all from the founding until quite recently. You know, we walk in with one pad and one pen. That hasn't changed, but everything else really has. And I think RonNell has already identified the big shifts. You know, we have to work quickly. We don't have editors anymore. When I started this job, I had a line editor and then an editor, and then a copy editor. Now, most of what we do just goes up because speed. Speed is the most important virtue. And I think the other thing that we've really seen change is clickiness. There's really no point in writing journalism that no one is going to consume, even though it's important. And so there's a tremendous amount of energy from the top down editorially on what do people want, as opposed to, you know, what might people need or what might be useful, and a tremendous premium on being first. And I know we're going to talk about being first, but what I have learned, particularly covering courts, is that the first reporting out of a court is almost always wrong, and that the third day story is the important one, and we don't do third day stories anymore, at least around the courts. And one of my favorite examples of that I think is of some utility is when King versus Burwell came down, and a friend of mine on the Supreme Court press corps had killed himself to write a third day story for a major paper and was told, like, that's old news. There's just no reflective, thoughtful, we're just churning. And I think that we've also really witnessed, because we can't pay journalists the way we used to, really the demise of, you know, what was my beat when I started, which is you go to a place and you get some money and you cover a trial. That's over. We can't pay anyone to do that. If we're very, very lucky, at Slate, we have law professors who are independently garnering an income, who can write about law for us. But the days of assigning somebody to do a legal story, go spend 2 weeks covering a trial, come back and tell us what happened, are over. The other just shakes fist at cloud news that I have to deliver is just the demise of journalists. You know, we're seeing buyouts, we're seeing entire newsrooms being gutted. We're seeing at Slate, we unionized last year because we had to unionize. We could literally not have hired a person of color if we did not profoundly change our model for how we recruit new young journalists. And as a consequence, I think we've seen a bunch of newsrooms that have unionized in the last 2-3 years have died almost as immediately on doing that. So we just don't have a model anymore. And I think that the other thing that warrants saying, if we're going to talk about the intersection of media and online culture, is that we all live under threat constantly, particularly women, that we are living in an era where, quite honestly, something comes in the mail or online that would have ended my career for fear 10 years ago that now I just live with and hope my kids can live with. And I think the very last thing I want to say, and this really is grim, is that I've just really seen an absolutely global belief that all journalism is lies. And probably the most sobering moment of my career after 20 years as a journalist is having my 15-year-old son say, it's all untrue. And I think that that's, when I think about the press clause in the First Amendment, the thing that I think is most pernicious is, in addition to sort of the eviscerating of local, timely news gathering, deeply researched, reflective opinion, the demise also of entire publications that cannot afford to pay their staff. I would say also most gutting for me is the demise of public confidence that truth is knowable, that journalists are reliable, and that there is a way to discern which is true and which is fake. And when I sort of see that downslope of public confidence that institutionally we're doing this in good faith and honorably, that's the part of this that I almost feel like we've hit a tipping point where I don't know to recapture it.
And I wonder if I could add one thing to that. It strikes me that in terms of the indirect effect that you're talking about of public distrust, the problem is that the interaction of social media, that is to say the distrust of Facebook as suppressing conservative voices, when seen along with the fake news attack on the legacy media, means that there is no locus of authority whatsoever within any of the media space. And so that social media has not been able to bring the legacy media back. And so, ironically, there's a lot of talk, I think, about sort of adversarial talk about the relationship between legacy press and journalists and social media. But in fact, the reality, I think, is much more of partnership and symbiosis. And the problem is that the partnership and symbiosis is not equal. And so when that added to the economic problems of the legacy press means really shaking one's fist, but maybe more crying.
I could cry too. Yeah, that's for later.
Lili, I want to sort of tease out a little more about that symbiosis and the sort of love-hate relationship between journalism companies and journalists, news gatherers, and social media companies, all of whom have been very careful to identify themselves as tech companies rather than media companies, right? The sort of the drawing of those lines. And particularly as we think about the sort of goal that we're thinking about on this panel of the continued production of good journalism, right? The question of sort of who pays for that, who produces for us actual good journalism, actual reportage, rather than just engaging in repeatage, right? We know there are lots of mechanisms for things to spread, but who engages in the hard work of gathering information? And I want to see if you can sort of tackle first. I know some of your work has sort of tapped into this question. The conventional wisdom, sort of critics have targeted Facebook and Google particularly for sort of what they think of as a duopoly over advertising dollars that once supported local journalism and national journalism, sort of pointing to their dominance over internet ads as the reason why news outlets are struggling. And it is true that the two companies do take in the vast majority of internet advertising revenue in the United States. Something like 65 cents on every dollar of advertising that is spent goes to Facebook or Google, and critics say that sort of the current level of level of just sort of money flow that goes in that direction leaves very little left over for newspapers that were already hurt in, after eras of declining print revenue. And I wonder if you can just sort of comment for us about whether, as a financial matter, the sort of dollars diverted to social media have undercut legacy media, or whether legacy media were sort of already in decline and this was inevitably happening, and whether there's something productive that we ought to be thinking about or doing on the dollar front to get ourselves to a place where someone is responsible and capable of producing conversations about matters of public concern.
Me, yeah, okay. Well, I think that the observations are true, but causality is, as ever, very difficult to parse. It strikes me that the answer to your question is yes and yes, not maybe as to the solutions part. But I think what the problem is that it's a combination of difficulties. I think that when you start thinking about how the legacy media paid for news. The legacy media paid for news through advertising. But advertising didn't come for the news. That legacy media, local newspapers, usually duopolies, would essentially bundle all kinds of news that citizens needed. So including the weather reports and, TV listings and all kinds of other things that would bring the advertising that would then pay for the accountability journalism and the editorial process and so on. So that advertisers had nowhere else to go, and so it was a wonderful marriage between advertisers and the legacy media, and they were awash in cash. That, of course, changed with the internet and Google and Facebook being able to figure out a way to provide global availability of advertising in a targeted way, shored up by data analysis. And that the newspapers were not able to do, and they had not gotten themselves into a position to do. Well, why not? Because I think of things that happened way prior to MySpace. And what were those things? It strikes me that, we have to remember something that Ed Baker told us in the 1990s, which was that the most important thing that happened to newsrooms was that they left family ownership and they moved to corporate ownership. And now what's happening is even further development, which is large-scale hedge fund and private equity investment, and flipping properties, buying properties, newspaper properties that are adjacent to one another, engaging in all kinds of cost-cutting, also in newsrooms. And so this shift, I think, was very important. The other shift that was very important that really started in the 1980s is the consolidation of media and the large amount of debt that involved, and so debt service required money being thrown to creditors first rather than to journalistic resources. Well, that is even more so today. Right now we have the Gannett and Gatehouse merger coming up, two behemoths in the newspaper space. Well, this is going to be a large ticket transaction, and so debt will have to be paid. We don't even know that the money is ever going to go to resource journalism, because it will go to debt service and it will go to share price concerns for stockholders that are intense, shall we say. So I think that those the concentration of ownership also leads to ideological changes. For example, Sinclair having bought so many stations, and so the strategies that have to do with concentration are separate and apart a threat. And so now there are moves afoot to try to share some licensing revenues of Facebook, talking about the upcoming News tab, Google and the Google News Initiative and so forth, trying to kick some money back to journalists. And those things are true and real and potentially very good. But the problem is that they do not address these other pieces of the landscape. So that's sort of the start of what I would have to say about that. Sorry I took so long.
Yeah, no, I think it's really helpful. Sometimes it feels like we take the snapshot of the current landscape in which we reside and fail to think about the wider trajectory of how we got where we got, and how sometimes what we're really dealing with are how old problems are new rather than entirely new problems.
And RonNell, I think if we were having this panel 15 years ago, we would have been complaining about classified advertising sites.
Yeah.
I mean, that was really sort of the first blow, right? We weren't as concerned about about Facebook and Google taking advertising dollars as much as we were about Craigslist.
Yeah.
And that was really the big blow to local newspapers especially. But I think as consumers, we can recognize that an online classified advertising is just a much more useful thing than the daily, opening up the paper in the morning and see who's selling something.
Right. Yeah. The days of mourning. Right. I do think that there were loads of people who subscribed to a daily newspaper 25 or 30 years ago for a single thing, right? The recipes or the sports. And they stumbled upon the city council meeting and the presidential election and accidentally became informed, useful citizens. And that model, right, we can spend our entire 90 minutes here mourning the loss of it, but it's gone. And so the larger question is sort of how we, in the current media landscape, think about press freedom and also think about supporting the values of the democratic institution of the press. I want to, thinking about these trajectories, I want to tap into some of the scholarship that you've done, Sonja, on the sort of legal and constitutional and colloquial definitions of the press. A lot of Sonja's work focuses on the press clause in the First Amendment, sort of who counts as the press for purposes of that clause and what utility that clause might have in constitutional jurisprudence. Can you sort of give us your sense of how the changing media landscape has shifted arguments about who counts as the press or complexified those arguments, especially thinking about sort of status-based or function-based definitions of the press? Is it worth continuing to think about the press clause and the constitutional rights of the press in an era where the fuzzy boundaries that we've just been talking about exist?
Sure. So yeah, I do talk about the press clause, and I often, when I'm asked to talk about it, the first thing I like to do is just remind people that the First Amendment does include these two different provisions dealing with expression that are close together. The freedom of speech, which we all know and love and celebrate all the time, and that the court talks about all the time and has empowered with enormous, wonderful rights and protections for all speakers. But it also says, or of the press, for press freedom that it protects. And historically, it's very clear that it was press freedom that was far more important to the founding generation than it was speech freedom. That was really more the afterthought. Yet the way our First Amendment jurisprudence has developed over time, we now have, as I said, this very robust set of speech rights, which I think is completely wonderful. But the press clause currently does virtually nothing. That the court doesn't explicitly recognize any unique right or protection as emanating solely from the press clause. So what the Supreme Court has done when it thinks about constitutional rights for the press is two things. One, at least for a while there, it loved to tell us how incredibly important the press was. They would just go off and give these little speeches. RonNell's written about this as well, and we've written together about how the press is essential to our democracy. It is this critical government watchdog. It is the handmaiden of justice. It is the eyes and ears of the public. That really our democracy as we know it could not survive without it. But then when the press came and said, hey, there's this right of protection that we really need, usually to gather news, and maybe a right of protection that really would not be workable or would make sense to give to everyone. But the question is whether there might be certain actors, certain speakers that should have this right, maybe do have this right under the First Amendment. The court has said no, thank you, that's impossible. And a large reason, and I'm talking about things like perhaps access to a prison or a testimonial privilege to say we shouldn't have to reveal our confidential sources, that kind of thing. And the court has said no, thank you. And big part of the reason is that they said we don't know how to figure out who the press is. So while the court chose not to enter that issue, they invited legislatures to do so. And for a long time, legislatures have done just that. They have passed an array of statutes and protections and regulations that do give members of the press certain privileges and rights that others don't. Credentialing privileges. There's a number that give recognize a reporter's testimonial privilege or special rates on getting freedom of information access, things like that. It's all been done statutorily. they defined the press in a variety of different ways, but one of the most common ways was to just take a look at the medium by which they communicated their information. They would, it was basically like if you wrote a newspaper or a magazine, or, were on TV or you were on the radio, then you could take advantage of these things. And that worked for a long time because those were all really pretty good proxies, actually. If you happen to have access to one of those media of communication, then there's a good chance you probably were doing the functions of the press. And so we were able to get by that way for quite a while. And so this, of course, has completely changed now, and those aren't proxies. What we have now is a world where what we think, I think, would all sort of agree of as the press, or at least a certain group of speakers we think function in a particularly unique way, in that they are informing the public about matters of public concern and they are checking our government for us. They're on Twitter right there, next to your neighbor and your mother-in-law and whatever, who else is on there tweeting about whatever. So the medium of communication is no longer this proxy. And that's led to a number of things. I mean, it really has blurred our landscape, and the Supreme Court mentioned just that in Citizens United. They actually mentioned it in a way that could be suggestive of the fact that they could someday become skeptical of even these legislatively granted rights and protections, because they found unconstitutional the media exception in that case to the campaign finance law, in part because they said this is speaker discrimination and you can't treat one group of speakers differently, and also we don't know who is the media and who's not, because it's all become very blurred. But it's also, on sort of a more practical level, I think just led to a lot of audience confusion. We don't all know. I know I don't all know. I read something on Twitter. I'm like, this is interesting. That's a long thread. It sounds informative. Who is this person? I try to figure it out, but it's all right in there with, the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalists that I also follow on Twitter. So it's very confusing, and we're losing that identifier of maybe who we can rely on, who has the reputation. This blurring of our media landscape has also led to this vulnerability of being fake news, because we do have not only people I think we would all sort of agree on are functioning as the press. We have people we would all agree on aren't functioning really as the press, but there is this weird middle ground, right? There's things like BuzzFeed and Gawker and whatever, where you're like, what are they exactly, and what exactly are they doing? And it can seem a little like this and a little like that. When one of these borderline organizations makes a huge error, people just think, can't trust the news media, fake news, right? Like, we don't know who they are and how exactly to draw these lines, which is really confusing. And we've seen this actually in the courts. The courts for a very long time, there's a number of different torts, for example, that newsworthiness, if you say publish something that was a private fact, but you did it for a newsworthy, because it was newsworthy, that was a defense. And for a very long time, the courts pretty much followed a rule that if a newspaper chose to put it in the newspaper, it was by definition newsworthy, and so they could have the defense. They just sort of deferred in that way, and now we're seeing them not do that anymore. They're being much more skeptical about newsworthiness, surely in part in response to this blurring that we're seeing. So it is making us focus a lot more on getting to the core of the function. What exactly is it that we think the press does that's different than just the rest of us sharing information, posting information about things in our lives, doing things that sometimes seem sort of press-like, something like, hey, there's a traffic jam downtown. I'm going to post it on, it's kind of news, that's kind of pressy, but, it doesn't make you necessarily function as the press. But that's a harder question. It's a harder question, and it may, to many, it's a reason that we abandon the entire project to even think about this question. I don't think so, but it certainly has made it more difficult.
Can I just, please, one point of information? The best meta example of what Sonja just described is trying to figure out the press credentialing process at the U.S. Supreme Court. I guarantee if you want to engage in an Escher staircase of logic, go and try to get a credential, like a hard pass at the U.S. Supreme Court. It is times a million the sort of deconstructing of what legitimate media is that Sonja's describing. And I just feel that if the highest court in the land can't figure out what a journalist is for its own purpose of coming and covering proceedings, it tells you how, this is a top-down problem.
Right, but the question then is the solution to just take those 30 seats reserved for the press and just open them up to first comers, right? Is that what we want? Or are there certain people who should be in those seats because they're doing important work on behalf of the public? And do we need to tackle that problem, even if it is unbelievably difficult and SCOTUS blog ends up without a press pass?
And I agree, but there's a clearly fracturing consensus about what the functions are now, largely because the notion of partisanship has infected so much of the press itself, and everybody thinks that the other press they don't like is actually partisan and not neutral. And so how do you define, for example, Fox News? Right? There are articles in the Columbia Journalism Review saying Fox News is actually state propaganda. And then there are obviously exactly the views that are exactly opposite. And so how does one define the boundary between opinion and factual reporting and all that? I think heavily complicated by the media ecosystem that has developed.
Yeah, and where I see this playing out is a really interesting shift in how the legacy news media advocates, for lack of any other term, start talking about definitions of journalism and what should be protected. Because I think historically, whenever there's been a need to define journalism in the law, whether it's through a shield law or accident scene access or press passes or anything, with the preference among media advocates, and this is true, is always to endorse a functional definition over a status definition, so that it wasn't just so that these rights weren't just to those employed by newspapers, but would allow for freelancers and others. And so we would settle on this functional definition that was something like someone who gathers news with the purpose, or gathers newsworthy information with the purpose of disseminating it to the public. And that seemed to be useful. But what I see now is a lot of advocates from legacy news media doing something that was really sort of anathema before, which is to try and add on to that and adheres to certain ethical standards and adheres to certain professional journalistic practices. And that's a huge shift, because before we were always, as media lawyers, very resistant to say, no, the ethical standards are voluntary self-regulation. They do not have the force of law. We do not want, for example, a negligence standard in a defamation case to be professional negligence. That should just be, that the journalist shouldn't be held to a higher standard of negligence. And now it seems like we're getting a lot of the advocacy I hear is, no, we need to give special rights to those who follow these standards. That's really giving a force of law to something that was specifically created not to have the force of law, and to which historically we as advocates have always been very resistant to.
David, how does that, how do the things that we've been talking about here about First Amendment values focused on the press map onto some of the things that we've been hearing just this last week? In particular, Mark Zuckerberg, you probably all, we all who are the organizers of this symposium feel a deep debt of gratitude to Facebook for being in the news this week. Thank you all very much for sort of making us seem so timely on this thing that we decided to do a calendar year ago. And suddenly it seems so hot topic that, I'm sort of literally ripping headlines over the last couple of days and seeing that the nation is talking about the sorts of things that we're wanting to talk about. Mr. Zuckerberg, you all might have seen, gave a speech at Georgetown, sort of rare, I think, large-scale public speech at Georgetown yesterday, in which he invoked sort of core American First Amendment values and described the importance of guiding sort of their corporate structure and their governance and decision-making, mapping onto some of those free speech values that he thinks are housed in sort of best practices about conversations on matters of public concern, which is our topic here today. David, what are your thoughts about the speech, and in what ways are we sort of connecting First Amendment values that were designed to guide government's relationship with its people into a new space that isn't a government space, but rather a space where a lot of our discussion of matters of public concern happen, but isn't governmentally, isn't our government.
Yeah, I should first say, just as I've always thought, even way before Facebook, I always thought that there was something really valuable about talking about First Amendment and free speech values in the absence of government. So to me, I don't limit free speech values as being just a government to a people relationship thing. When I talk about First Amendment rights, I do. When I talk about free speech values, which I think are a greater universe than First Amendment rights, I don't. So I really appreciate the sentiment that was expressed yesterday. I'm skeptical of it being implemented in a way that I'll be happy with, but I appreciate the sentiment, and I think sometimes I think you see the role that. I don't like talking about the whole internet as Facebook, but the role that Facebook plays around the world, I think is a lot different than what we see in the U.S. I think a lot of U.S. users sort of look at Facebook as being like, how you find out how much you disagree with the politics of your high school friends, and and how you share vacation photos and photos of children and things like that. And I think in other parts of the world, Facebook really plays this sort of unique role where it's the only way people can communicate with each other effectively. And so when you have people living under repressive governments and where many other avenues of communication are blocked, the fact that Facebook is still available to them is a very powerful thing. The ability to organize, distant groups to organize, these are all really powerful things that fit really nicely into a classic free speech model. And so I'm really pleased to hear Zuckerberg talk about that, to hear Facebook say that. And to me, there still is this ideal of an unmoderated platform that really is the place where everyone can speak. So I think, I like the sentiment. I think the problem is that because of Facebook's size, which is great because it does allow people to connect who otherwise wouldn't have been able to, it's almost impossible because of its size and because of its business model to, I think, actually fulfill that free speech promise. I don't know that's necessarily anything that it did on purpose, and maybe it just sort of fell on them that way. But I think to try and be this open place, but to also sort of recognize that there might be some responsibility to not be that place, that's a really hard thing to reconcile. I'm very resistant to this tech company, media company dichotomy. It's one of my pet peeves, and because under U.S. law it doesn't matter 96% of the time whether someone there's no reason under U.S. law to label someone a tech company or a media company. I think that's typically a proxy for one of two things. One is, do you create content or not? And the other thing is, do you actually comply with journalistic practices or not? And those might be, so I'm happy to talk about that distinction, but I think when Facebook talking about being a champion of the First Amendment and being an open forum to the greatest extent possible, we're going to, it's falling more into, it doesn't to me fit into either of those models, right? It's more trying to be the public square, right? Just a place for people to communicate and meet. And that's not something newspapers did before, and it's not something necessarily that tech companies do either.
Yeah, I want to ask you, Sonja, about this question about social media as the public square, and particularly social media as a public forum. I know you've done some thinking about government use of social media, and particularly the president's and other elected officials. But the key case law that we have on the front in this question is Twitter-focused case law, focusing on the president's use of Twitter. And I wonder if we can think for a second about the role in this larger conversation that we're having of the president's ability to bypass the press on social media and speak directly to people, or as some of this case law has suggested, right, refuse to speak to the public. Whether that's weakened traditional press models, but also whether what role it has in this wider web of conversation that we're having about news and information and discussion of matters of public concern in a social media age.
Yeah, sure. I mean, going back to the point earlier about how the world of all of this didn't start once Facebook took hold. It also didn't start once President Trump was inaugurated. A lot of these forces were already very much in motion before all of these things started to happen, including sort of what Dahlia referred to as the forces that were starting to weaken what we do think of as our traditional or mainstream press. And what we were seeing is that the press really relied not so much always on laws, but a number of sort of non-legal things that really gave them power. They relied on their financial strength that they had, which at one point was quite immense, and they relied on the public's trust, which at one point was at very high highs, and it reached its bottom, according to Gallup, in 2016 in terms of public trust in the press. They relied on, a number of different norms and traditions about how people thought about the press, how politicians talked about the press. And another thing that they relied on a great deal to have power was that they had this mutual relationship with government actors, and particularly with politicians and office holders, which was the press needed something from them. Call it a quid pro quo, if you would. The press needed something from the politicians. They needed information, right? They needed access. They needed to be able to gather the information. They needed to be able to gather the news so they could go and disseminate it to the rest of us. But the politicians needed something from the press, which was they needed to get their message out to the public. And it was really the press that held the keys to that real ability. If you wanted to get your message out to the public, out to your constituents, out to your voters, you needed to have the press amplify what it was you were going to say. So what we're seeing now, and one of the many things we're seeing now, is that the press is losing that power too. They're losing that foothold because now these politicians, they don't need the press anymore to reach the public. Let's say, for example, our president, right, who now has this Twitter feed where he can just say whatever he wants. He doesn't need to rely on the news media to get it out. We have other politicians, of course, doing the same thing, bypassing the press, going straight to the public without that, having to give that access. And now, I would say, not coincidentally, we have a White House, that went 200 and however many days without a White House press briefing, and has, White House press secretary, thank you, who has not stood before the podium in the White House press briefing. These norms that were unthinkable. We now have a White House that simply doesn't respond to questions of really hugely important issues that are going on, which was, reporters are saying to us, this was unthinkable. Unthinkable that something like this would happen. The major news outlets would come to the White House saying, we need, what's your response to this question? What's your comment on this? And they get nothing, right? Because suddenly they don't really have that leverage that they once had.
Well, go ahead. Well, I was just going to say briefly, I think there's some really interesting reciprocity there as well, because it's not just, the norms are falling away and the press can't get what it wants from institutions, but I have found just in the last 5-6 years interviewing judges that they have completely lost confidence in the press. Partly because of the things we started with, which are, gutted newsrooms, a reporter who's on the press beat this week, who was the weatherman last week, and next week is going to be, the city council reporter. So no real expertise left in the press. I've really noticed that judges have such grievous doubts about the competence of the press that are more attributable to the economic models that you were talking about than any dysfunction. It's not that journalists got bad. It's just that we can't do this anymore. And as a consequence, judges who for years would have said, oh, I know everybody on the beat. They've been on the beat for 20 years. They come to my Christmas party. There's a deep trusting relationship here are very apt now to say, I don't talk to anyone because they all are terrible. And I've actually seen, and you guys have written about this too, that starting to inflect into doctrine even at the Supreme Court level. So justices talking about the press as though, not in the sort of abstract Woodward and Bernstein way that was, fondly, I like the idea of the press, but I don't like the press when it's fixed on me, but a much more pernicious suspicion about the entire enterprise of journalism that is, I think, a function of this feedback loop. So I just think it works both ways.
And I would add to that, it's not entirely new, right? I mean, Roosevelt started this with the fireside chats, directly speaking to the public through the radio. So what is the difference? What is the problem? Obviously, amplification. That's the obvious thing. But I think there's something else that feeds into what the two of you were saying, which is that the sheer number of tweets, for example, that the president writes, create this obsessive and chaotic response on the part of the press, assessing, responding, et cetera, which then makes the press look like it's sort of all over the place and unable to fact check, unable to decide what's important and what's not important, and effectively allowing the Twitterer, who is the representative of the government, to essentially legitimate whatever news he or she is reading. So that there is that who decides the newsworthiness is entirely the person who tweets, who is relying on some but not all, and not necessarily legacy news sources. And so it's a repositioning of the locus of newsworthiness finding, I think, as a result.
Yeah.
I just want to throw out there, I think this is obvious, but I generally think that the absence of gatekeepers is a good thing in terms of communicating with the public. And I'm a big I have 2 print newspapers in my bag I picked up this morning. I want to find a solution to keep newspapers alive. They can hire more reporters. But the idea that the president can communicate directly with people, I actually think is a really good thing. And I think if people, those of us who complain about a lot, really are complaining about what the president is saying, and not about the fact that he has the ability to communicate directly. And if those who I think agree with what this president says, really appreciates that, and I think that will flip. And so I think those are good things. I think these are things that we don't want to get rid of. And so and I generally feel that way about the ability of people to communicate directly and share their thoughts without having to have professional training, without having to know how to code, without having to own a printing press. I mean, I think these are all good things. I think there's a challenge is how do we preserve all of these good things, but also try to recapture this other really good thing that happened that really relied, as Lili said, on actually be able to force advertisers to use them, not because the people selling cars loved the press and wanted to keep newspapers alive, but because that was the only way they could sell cars.
Yeah.
I would like to just say, okay, gatekeepers, the absence of gatekeepers in this way of being able to get messages out, I could see that. But I think there is a loss here, and maybe the word would be a loss of curators, maybe would be the better word, because I think another really important function that the press, however you think of it in your head, has done for a very long time is not only gather news for us and not only give us this information, but they have put it in context for us, and they have signaled to us its importance, right? We knew when a story was on the front page, or particularly, top of the fold front page, this was an important story. Maybe I should take a look at it, and maybe I should read the rest of the stories on the front page. Or it was the top of the newscast. They were able to tell us these things, even though I only turned on the newscast and I'm waiting for the weather. But I'm going to see this, and they're telling me that it's important. That kind of curating, of course, is still going on, but it's not going on anymore by trained professional journalists who follow ethical rules, or however you want to think of them, but rather it's being done by all algorithms that we don't see, we don't understand what it's valuing, or who exactly is it trying to whose interests it's really looking after versus journalists who have the interests of, as a whole, at least, of the public and of having public information.
Yeah. I want to make sure that we save good time both for comments and questions from our assembled experts and for the rapidly bulging list of questions that participants are already submitting to Slido. But I want to make sure that I have a chance to ask the folks on this panel, in our panel setting, about something that Andy mentioned sort of briefly, and that lots of folks who have been talking about the intersection between news and social media have talked about a lot, which is sort of the efficacy or value of social media and broad-scale media literacy education, right? How much can we train people? How capable are people of being taught to be savvier consumers and sifters of information flow? And so I'm interested in hearing from all of you your thoughts about media literacy efforts sort of writ large. Are they necessary? Are they useful? If they are, what should their focus be? Really, what is the sort of ideal news consumer behavior in this new journalistic environment? And could we, as an educational matter, help people on the news consumption end become the kind of people who crave I'm just going to the right sorts of information and are capable of sorting to get useful, helpful discussions of matters of public concern?
Well, I've written about this a little bit hopefully, and now I'm getting nervous. About that. So what I've said before was that media literacy, or let's say information literacy, is a good idea to put resources into, but it has to be done intelligently. And one of the things that a lot of the educational legislation in this area has not done so much is really to mine the developing information that the cognitive and social psychologists are coming up with about how people develop beliefs and, the heuristics and knee-jerk responses that people have, and then try to control for that. So that was a sort of hopeful thing to say. And then the second thing that I thought about that I hadn't written about, but I think is true, is that I think we also need to focus information literacy on journalists themselves. That journalists themselves need to understand how to use data better, how to analyze data better, but also, and new reports are coming out showing that there are extremely sophisticated forms of source hacking and other kinds of journalistic manipulation that are going on, that journalists need to become sort of, CIA-trained, tradecraft specialists or something like this. And so that's sort of hopeful too, because you can imagine, training in these kinds of things. Now, what makes me nervous is that all of this is for naught if, in fact, we begin to have a really sophisticated deployment of political deep fakes. Deep fakes right now are basically, they come out of the porn world, and it's basically an anti-feminist kind of effort that comes out of, the depths of Reddit forums and so on, but that's changing radically. So that leads me to the question of there's no way that an individual, even learning all of the stuff that I'm talking about, will be able to figure out what is a fake video and what isn't in the political context. And so that means AI, and that means maybe not just Facebook, though, maybe universities. Now, how much information is Facebook, our Facebook, Google, and other private entities that are essentially vaults of data, how much are they willing to share about their algorithm that will help with this kind of separating out what is true and what is fake in increasingly technologically sophisticated and seamless artificial reality? So that's why I'm nervous.
David, do you have views on the media literacy question?
I do, yeah. When someone in 2016, when I first was asked the question, what should Facebook do about all this disinformation? And I think the point of the question was, how do they remove all this content? And my answer was, well, Facebook should give someone $23 billion for a massive media literacy education campaign. And I made that number up. So I'm a fan of media literacy, and I have been as long as I've been doing free speech work. It's always been the thing we've pointed to as an alternative to censorship. But I'm also not under the illusion that it solves the problem. But I do think it helps. But the best thing about media literacy is I think it's the way of addressing the problem where there's fewest conflicts among human rights. If you're taking a sensorial approach, you're obviously going to have conflicts between whatever harm you're trying to prevent, whatever human right you're trying to prevent, and the human right of freedom of expression. Media literacy is you're doing a line that I think best avoids those conflicts. So I'm not saying it's the most effective approach that solves the problem, but I do think it's the most rights consistent approach. So I think we should do it, and I do think one of the goals should not just be the traditional media literacy goal, which is how do you scrutinize material, how do you identify, how do you distinguish between good information and bad information, but also just trying to instill a desire and a value to want good information and to
be an informed member of a democracy.
Trusted sources, like why it's important to have those.
Yeah. Sonja or Dahlia?
Yes, I mean, media literacy would be terrific. In particular, I think just more understanding among the general public about how journalists go about doing their work. The number of people who actually believe that when the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal cites to an anonymous source for an important piece of information, who thinks that anonymous source is anonymous as to the reporters and as to the editors at the newspaper is really quite staggering. That they don't just truly understand how the process of journalism works. I'll also say, just as a pet peeve, that I think the news organizations themselves could really help by not falling into the trap of blurring all of these lines between news and opinion and entertainment and anything else. For a very long time, the label of news analysis has been a pet peeve of mine because it confuses me greatly, and I often don't know what I'm reading. And we saw this blow up with that New York Times piece about Justice Kavanaugh that was the book excerpt that was labeled news analysis, but it was on the opinion page, and then it had hard news facts that were in it amidst all these other issues. It was incredibly confusing. I read through it, and I texted some people on this panel, right, saying, I don't know what I just read, and this is what we do for a living. So I would love to see the press itself try to take on some of this burden too.
Dahlia.
Yeah, I think I'd probably leave off where I started, which is my 15-year-old, now 16-year-old son, who doesn't consume any form of media that we have talked about today. Everything, he thinks, all due respect, that Facebook is for the olds, and he thinks, all due respect, like Google is ridiculous, and his news consumption happens on Instagram. And lest you think I'm slurring that, I will tell you that when we lived in Charlottesville in the summer of 2017, the best news reporting that we got of the Nazi March was on his Instagram feed, what his friends were posting, which was more true than anything I saw in the mainstream media for a week. But I just think one of the things that's paradoxical, with this whole framing, we've been talking about fighting the last war, and the very notion of a public square is the last war, the very notion that all of our First Amendment doctrine was framed in the 1920s and 30s when people couldn't say, you goddamn racketeer. We're so far away doctrinally from where doctrine is. And so I think this is one of those funny moments where we can teach media literacy and in 20 years have a very media literate bunch of people who don't consume anything that we recognize as media. And so I think we just
target question.
Have to be a little bit mindful of the fact that what we're talking about fixing now is not even something necessarily that, I'm looking at law students, I don't even know that it's something that they will be consuming in 5 years.
Right. Okay, so we want to spend our remaining 15 or 20 minutes thinking about what you would like this panel of experts to discuss with you. We're going to start with an exchange with the assembled other experts who are here from other fields to talk in the symposium. What questions do you all have for the panel?
Thank you. Yeah, wonderful panel. So I'd like to go back to something that Dahlia said in her first comments on the panel, which was this idea that there's this economic pressure now that the media faces to give people what they want and not necessarily what they need. And it strikes me that that maps onto a kind of tension within newsworthiness as an idea, which is, newsworthiness can be what do we think the public should know, or it could be what do they want to know. And when it comes to the way that Facebook is thinking about newsworthiness, we know very little about how they're defining newsworthiness. We know Zuckerberg talked about this yesterday in his speech. It is a blanket exception to all of their content moderation rules, but they don't define it in their content moderation rules. But the little that we do know suggests that they take this very descriptive approach to newsworthiness, and they look at all of these cues for what the people want to know. And the way that he talks about free expression also goes along those lines. It's like, we don't think we should be making these decisions. We should have information out there and the public just decides. And so I want to maybe invite you to comment on how this ties in not just to a demise or pressure on journalism, but also this deterioration on expertise and professionalism, and maybe to hope that there could be something positive on the horizon, who knows, about are moves like, for example, the Facebook Oversight Board, something that we can look to as a source of hope, where there may be development of professional norms and expertise coming back into the loop? Are there other ways in which we can maybe slow the process down and develop these norms that previously existed in legacy media, but that now are lacking? Or is that the wrong way to think about these problems?
Do you want me to take a crack? And I'd rather hear what the panelists have to say. I think I would just say two things that may or may not be responsive. But one is, I'm always arrested at the sort of Cass Sunstein Daily Me model of, once we lost what RonNell described as the sort of accidental brush with an opinion that was not the opinion you started the day with, and once we began to curate media in whatever form so as to reinforce what people already believe. And I want to be very careful to say, because I hate the eat your broccoli model, right? What people need, as though I can tell them what they need to be a civic minded citizen. But I do think that any algorithm that allows you to end your day thinking you're smarter because you read 40 things that conform with what you already believed and 0 things that are provocative or different from what you believed has fundamentally been, I think, at the root of, it may be newsworthy and it's news. It's also not allowing us to be anything other than more polarized. And I think the other thing, that I would just say is one of the things I worry about, and I say this again self-interestedly as a reporter who, goes into the Supreme Court and really needs to, spend a week preparing for every case and who needs to do shoe leather reporting in order to do my job, is that the demise of the idea that expertise matters, that the BuzzFeed listicle of the 20 sickest burns that RBG dropped today, and which will, by the way, get exponentially more traffic than anything I will ever write. But that's, I think, what we're consuming. I can't make people want to, understand the Dormant Commerce Clause. I can't. But I think that the fact that we have almost entirely obliterated the idea that people should get paid to do weeks of work reading the red brief and the blue brief, and by the way, the green briefs, and trying to unpack something, and that I haven't had a raise in 13 years. I think there it is. But I think that really kind of, for me, that married to the problem of the Daily Me suggests that that's, at least as a journalist, where I think the system not only is broken, but I don't know how to get out of that spiral.
I'm just happy that someone's reading the green briefs.
Yeah.
To me, I think this is another one of those areas where we've really seen a shift of how we as media lawyers, we'd always historically wanted courts to adopt a really, really expansive definition of matter of public interest to give and all the protections that came along with that in defamation cases, and otherwise. And now it's almost like, well, we didn't mean that, and. I still think and I get concerned about having sort of a centralized determiner of newsworthiness, and I hope that's not what the oversight board becomes, where it's sort of determining for everybody what it is. Obviously, this is a completely relative thing, and what's newsworthy to one person is going, and that's so. So I just want to know that this is another area where we've all of a sudden seen this tension between this value we've always promoted, a very highly expansive definition of what's a matter of public interest, and what information should get to people now to maybe a concern, how have we gone too far with that? I hope we haven't. I do think the concerns about how we're fed information that is both beyond our control as a user and otherwise non-transparent are legitimate concerns.
Well, I think that zooming out a little bit, when we think about what problems face social media today, it seems to me that there are two. One is this argument that news organizations, legacy news organizations, make, which is that Facebook and the others currently are free riding, that they are not paying for content that they are using, and that therefore what we need to do is regulate in one way or another to prevent the free riding. So whether or not there's regulation that's pending, such as, for example, the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act, which seeks an antitrust waiver for collaborative negotiation with Facebook over licensing fees, or some breakup proposals, such as the ones that Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren have been making as part of their campaigns. Whatever it is, those are attempts to regulate in this space, and Facebook and Google are privately trying to address those issues, maybe short of regulation, by proposing voluntarily to share some licensing revenues and so on with the news organizations. But there's also something else that's going on at the same time. And by the way, let me just say that, one of the things that struck me about what you said, Andy, at the beginning was that Facebook is looking for regulation. Facebook does not want to be the emperor of speech, if you will. And that's both good and also reminds me of the 1930s when what were going to become the oligopolistic broadcasters, networks, decided that they wanted to have a quid pro quo with the government for regulation, so long as they behaved within the journalistic norms live at the time. And so that there's an interesting relationship between, obviously, voluntary seeking for regulation and the kinds of border protective or competition protective effects that could end up coming along with that. But the thing is that this is in a kind of potentially pernicious feedback loop with the second problem, which is, I think, the public's desire for commons management and sort of editorial judgment, newsworthiness findings that are maybe able to be, disputed, of course, but that are there, that there is a curatorial or editorial activity going on. People want Facebook to solve for this. And so exactly how those two problems interact with one another, sometimes perniciously and problematically, I think is something that the Facebooks of this world are going to have a very hard time solving for, because it's complicated.
Are there other questions from our assembled experts? Oh, yes. Do we have the microphone?
Hi. I'd like to follow up on something that Professor Levy had mentioned, which made some references to sort of historical antecedents. And I was thinking about how with every kind of technological invention or revolution, there's always a period of disruption, with the mention of radio, telegraph, TV. I'm sure print newspapers were quite threatened by the existence of these new media platforms. But there's a period of disruption and then fragmentation, and then it settles, right? I always try to resist this notion of the halcyon days when TV, print, and media were all living peacefully before this time. So I was wondering, is there something different about this particular moment with this specific new media platform that is an existential threat to democracy? Or do you find this to be, or do you think that it's going to be something, we're going through a period of upheaval right now, but then eventually settle?
The same as when all old technologies were new. We always threw up our hands and panicked. Does anybody have thoughts on that? Is this a unique moment, or is it a moment that with some hindsight we will see as just being a moment of transition?
Well, for me, I think that the answer is one that RonNell answered several years ago in writing her paper. The big differentiator, it seems to me, is this issue of public trust in the press. That is just gone. And that, to me, is a huge moment of difference.
That's why I brought Lili.
There are very few institutional.
Go ahead. Yeah. Okay, we have several really interesting questions, themes of questions that have been submitted by Slido that I want to pose to the panel. One question that I hadn't thought about would emerge, but of course has emerged. Several people would like to know this panel's view about the potential of legacy press or news gathering as a practice, organizing through nonprofit mechanisms as nonprofit organizations. And by way of background for everybody who is in the audience who isn't local, or for our experts who aren't local, our local newspaper, the Salt Lake Tribune, was recently converted into a nonprofit model. And so folks are really interested. Several people have sort of cited the Tribune or other creative endeavors in that front to ask whether this is a viable way for either legacy media or the core functions of discussion of matters of public concern in a social media age to stay alive and relevant, or whether this changes news dynamics in too significant ways.
So I'm just as a consumer of news, I support several nonprofit journalism models. I don't think it's the solution. I think we need other models as well, but I certainly think it's a way to go. We have to go away from the advertising-based one, right? Yeah. That's clear. And so I think this is, I think that's certainly one of the things that should be explored, and I hope people support them.
I'm a big fan of the nonprofit model. I have no idea if it's viable. That's outside my wheelhouse, but partly because when I just talk to people, people pretty much already think about their subscriptions to any news organizations as an act of charity. They'll come to me with pride to tell me, that they subscribe to the New York Times, to which I say, that's great, subscribe to your local newspaper. They need it much, much, much more.
That's funny.
For all of you. And it also frees, and journalists are often in this issue because they very much want their news out there. They want their news to reach the public. And so they have that instinct. That's their mission. That's what they want to do. But at the same time, they need to find some way to make money from it. And the nonprofit model helps with that. It also releases them from having to rely on advertisers who say, I will not have my advertisement be in a story that has this list of words because I don't like those words in them, or I need a story that does have a reference to this. It frees them from those kinds of pressures. If it's viable, I would think it would be wonderful.
There's currently legislation pending that apparently will deal with tax issues that make it difficult for news organizations to switch to nonprofit status. I know zero more about it. Just thought I would flag that it exists.
I would just say, because we haven't said the word podcast today, but I have one.
Sell a mattress.
And I sell mattresses, which is its own shameful secret. But I do think that one of the things we have sort of presumptively started from, the idea that advertising is dead. But I will say the rise of podcasting in the last, in my, very recent past, and watching advertising that, cleared out from this entire online world, we could never figure out a model. And the subscription model, works very well for like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and nobody else. But I will say that podcasting, the advertisers have, bless their mattressy hearts, but they have gravitated to advertising, old school advertising on podcasts in a way that's interesting. And so again, I think we're a little bit fighting the last war, and it's useful to see that new media is arising that is able to capture advertisers, in a way that is fair and equitable for journalists, that may obviate some of these concerns going forward.
And the Procter and Gamble hour.
Yeah,
Back
no,
again.
Yes, it is.
It's hilarious. It's exactly. I always say it's like when the Andrews sisters used to,
Totally.
they'd be like,
Toothpaste jingle.
buy Lucky Strikes, but like it worked, and that as a model for how radio advertising worked is exactly when I am purveying mattresses. It feels filthy, but boy, it's money's good.
So I do just want to add that to me, one of the main values, my advice to people has always been, when people say, what can we do? I said, well, you should pay for your news. You should subscribe to newspapers. You should subscribe to the ones that you agree with and the ones you disagree with. But not everyone can afford to. Everyone, I think, has a human right to receive information, and not everybody has the ability to pay for it. And so a nonprofit model that can be supported by noblesse oblige or however, it really plays an important role. And that was one of the benefits of advertiser-supported journalism, was that it did make journalism. There actually were free thing, that were completely ad support, that weren't subscription. And it is important to have something where people actually can get their news without a financial barrier.
Well, the problem with subscriptions, though, is weird, right? I mean, not only does it work for the New York Times and maybe Wall Street Journal, but ultimately the latest study I read said that people are willing to subscribe to one thing. And that's what they do. Maybe they spend about $10 a month. They're willing to do that if they can afford it. What does that mean? That means that there's going to be a push to aggregation, because obviously they're going to want to pay $10 to be able to see as many content from as many providers as possible. Well, that's going to be Apple News, okay? So what does Apple News have? It doesn't have any local news. Even if a particular story is originated in a local paper, then it gets picked up by everybody else fancy, and then the fancy people are going to be the ones that are going to be at the top of the recommendation. So that the skews of the aggregation model will also impact the effectiveness of the subscription model in complicated ways, I think.
Yeah. So we're out of time, but one of the things I'm most grateful for is that some of the questions that have been submitted are things that are going to continue to be super relevant to the next panel and to the afternoon discussion. And I hope that you've seen already some of the synergies, the kinds of things that people are talking about information as a human right, and about the intersection between truth and truth-telling and the social media environment. So stay tuned for more discussion of some of these same ideas. I think at least some of these questions that we haven't been able to get to, we can pose to additional panels and continue the conversation. We'll break now and come back for the disinformation panel that begins at 11. See you all.
It's fun.